Right to Detroit PODcast. Let's get on to the off-season primer we've been doing over just the last week, really. We did offense, and if you want to go and take a listen to that, that is on the feed. It's on the feed. I don't need to include a link to anything. It's on the feed. Subscribe to the feed. Spotify, iTunes, all those feeds. Go and it's right there for you. Now we're going to do defense. And I'm kind of holding my breath here because we went really long last time. So we'll see how long we go on this. So we go position by position on this. We talk about the cores, where they're at, and what we can do what the Lions can do as far as free agency, including retaining or dismissing players they currently have, who they can get through free agency, or where they should target someone in, say, if it's a position they should prioritize more towards the draft. So let's start at the top. Let's start with the defensive tackles. And there's a few questions here, and I think it starts with Bugs and Brockers. So I guess, let's start with a more veteran one, Jeremy. Brockers, do you think he's likely gone from the team?
I think it's almost certain. Sad to say. I mean, he cost $14 million against cap if they keep him, and he did not play almost at all in the back half of the season. You don't pay $14 million for a guy who brings together an all players meeting once a year. And I'm trying not to be insulting to Brockers because he's had a long, illustrious career, but it's clear the Lions want to be younger. It's clear the Lions want more players that can get them, production on the field. And so Michael Brockers just is not that guy anymore. I don't think there's ever been a more clear decision to make on a kind of cap casualty type of guy. They're going to take a $4 million cap hit, which is unfortunate, but it's not huge considering $14 million is a worse hit. So you save $10 million off the cap, where you're projected to have right now. But that means you're going to have to fill some other, spots, because if you cut him, these are the guys that are signed on for 2023 right now: Aleem McNeil, Levi Onwuzurike, and Demetrius Taylor. You need some help there. You need a whole lot of help there.
You do. You need talent that not only is depth, but you need a starter. I think you need a starter next to Aleem.
So is Bugs that guy? Let's start with Bugs. He's a guy who essentially became that starter and consistently got praise from this coaching staff. Do you bring him back as a starter? Do you bring him back as a depth piece? Or do you say, thanks for the year, we're looking to upgrade here?
I don't know. Chris, do you think that you look at Bugs as an opportunity to say, hey, we got the most out of a player this season, and maybe he can count towards, whatever compensatory pick formula if we let him go now and he signs away? Or do you look at that as, hey, this is a guy that we got the best production out of, let's keep him around?
It's hard too, because what's the MO has been to reward players who step up.
Yeah.
And Bugs, I feel like, kind of like we saw with guys last year, although that brings some risks, right? Like AJ Parker performed well last year. I don't think anyone's going to
Charles Harris,
think much of him. Harris is another great example, sure. So I think the Lions are in the business of rewarding said performances, but at the same time, like the tackles, it feels like the replacement level there is easier to hit than corners.
Yeah, look at when they got Bugs, right? They signed him in August,
right?
So yeah. It wasn't anything where he was a big time free agent acquisition. And I'll be honest, obviously a lot of these questions are going to be like, should they bring this player back? And the answer is always going to be, well, it depends on the price,
right?
But I think that's true for Bugs in the aspect that I think he's probably best served as a rotational player.
Yeah,
I don't know if I necessarily view him as he's a guy that I want playing each and every down, and there isn't a player behind him that's better than him.
But
and that's no knock on Bugs,
right? But in a way, that makes him the kind of perfect, easy re-signing. He made less than $1 million last year. He's gonna obviously get a bump there. Probably not a ton. Like I don't think he's getting more than $2 million a year or anything like that. But he gives you options, right? He makes it so that we know he can start and play at a decent level, average level maybe. But
And he can flash a little too.
And he can flash a little bit too. But at the same time, it doesn't prevent you from going out and drafting a guy. It doesn't prevent you from going out and upgrading the position, because you'd love to have that kind of guy coming off the bench. Whereas this year, the guy coming off the bench was what's his name, Benito Jones. And Benito Jones is probably going to come back too, because he's one of those exclusive rights free agents, which basically are free re-signings. They come back on minimum salary deals. You bring him back. If he's just a camp body, then he's just a camp body. You need camp bodies. You need to fill out the roster to 90, so he's probably back. But then the question is, okay, so let's say you do bring back Bugs. You do bring back Benito Jones. Brockers is gone. How do we upgrade the position? What are you guys looking at? Is this a draft position? Is this go out and sell out like everybody seems to want for Deron Payne? Is there someone else in that free agency list that you guys are interested in?
I feel like free agency is going to be it's going to be free agency. I feel like it's just going to be tinkering around the edges. I feel like the talent that they do have for defensive tackle they've been drafting is talent they still trust to develop. And I feel like what's going to happen is it's just like guys like Bugs, they're just going to find probably replacement pieces out there or something like that. But they're not going to be big name signings, but this is an offense that seems to like itself a lot more on the edges.
Yeah,
geez.
Well, I will say about the Deron Payne stuff is he's going to be very expensive. He was 9th among interior defensive linemen in pressures last season, and that was kind of like a down year for him.
He's 26.
But,
They're about to be
right.
26.
But I think the thing is maybe buyer beware. You dig into some of those statistics, like he had like the 4th highest missed tackle percentage rate in the NFL among interior defensive linemen, and it's a reflection in why his run defense grade was as bad as it was. I'm sure of it. So are the Lions really in the business of paying a guy just to be a pretty much pure pass rusher at that position?
Probably not.
I don't think so. I think you pay for those pure pass rushers on the edges. Yeah. I don't think you do that up the interior.
But at the same time, it feels like such a big need, right? They've invested so heavily in those edges already that if they could just figure out one guy who can be disruptive over the middle, it could change everything, right? And we've seen that across the league. There's not a lot, right? It's a pretty scarce resource to have a defensive tackle that can just completely disrupt a game, but when they do, it's huge. And so I think that's why a lot of people have fallen in love with Deron Payne. A lot of people have fallen in love going in the draft with Jalen Carter. And it is a big position of need, but I feel like it's a scarce resource in getting one of those huge upgrades from a guy like Isaiah Bugs. And so it's going to cost them a lot, whether it's in draft resources or in free agency money, but
let's talk about the edges then. Okay. So because I feel like that's where because Brockers might be the cap casualty for the tackles, but on the edges, there's a lot of savings that probably need to be done. That starts with Romeo Okwara. So right now he would cost you about $14.5 million, save about $7 million with a cut. Kind of the same deal with Charles Harris. You'd save about $4 million of $8 million to cut. Okwara, I think, is the more that's the more fascinating question to answer, right? Like, is it just the injury history in there and everything else? Like, it's that one's hard for me to figure out.
I think two things make it probably the most. I'm gonna say it's the most important decision that Brad Holmes has to make that isn't draft related this offseason is what he wants to do with Romeo Okwara, because I think personally, if you're looking at the two guys, Charles Harris had 1 year. Yeah. Romeo Okwara only kind of had 1 year where he, earned the contract that he signed.
Right.
Okay. I'm of the mind that I think that Brad Holmes should bet on the extra, $6.5 million it's going to cost to keep Romeo, rather than going with Charles Harris to save a little bit more money in the here and now. I think that we probably have, and this might be a discredit to Charles Harris, but I think there's more promise with Romeo Okwara than Charles Harris. So I think that's
Yeah.
ultimately you pay that 6.5 million premium to see, hey, with a full offseason of getting back to full health, can Romeo Okwara be the dude that we paid him to be?
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the crux of the debate here because I don't think there'd be a lot of debate that Romeo Quara is a better player than Charles Harris. I think that's true, but he's going to cost more, and he's still coming back from a more devastating injury, right? The Achilles.
True.
There's no guarantee that he gets back to where he was, even though now it's been well over a year since he suffered the injury. Sometimes it takes more than that. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 years, and then by that time Romeo's hitting close to 30. And you never, I mean, he's probably already pretty close to 30 at this point. But both of these are really tough decisions to me. And I don't have a strong feeling one way because that is a lot of savings. You cut both those guys, you create 11 million in cap space. Lions can do a lot with that.
Well, let me ask you then, because like, is it we talked about Jalen Carter there in the draft. It's not insane if the Lions, would you guys be okay if they draft another edge high? I'm not saying at like in the top 10, but if we're like that second, what is it, 16?
18,
The second,
yeah.
18, excuse me. Like if they take an edge there.
I'm not against it. I mean, I truly have the belief that there's no such thing as too many pass rushers. And listen, I think John Kaminsky is coming back. I think Aiden Hutchinson is ready to take a next step. James Houston is going to be good. Who knows what the future of Josh Pascal is? Let's hope he doesn't fall into the second round curse. But you got 4. I mean, that's already 4.
Yeah, I think there's some questions around Houston if he can play like every snap.
Sure,
but
right. But I mean, but at the same time, like with those 4, I mean, oh god, they're so young too, right? 3 of those guys you drafted last year. But
Pascal missed a lot of time too.
Right,
Sure.
and so he could certainly be better than what he showed, and I think the expectation is he'll be a lot better than he showed. But a lot of those guys can also swing in on the inside on passing down. So then you have your opportunity to throw more guys out there. And so, I want the team to maybe be 5 deep, and so I guess it'd be tougher to sell me on bringing in another edge if you keep Romeo or Charles, because then you already have 5 deep. Assuming Kaminsky comes back. But if you cut both, which I'm not saying they will do, I think it's probably more likely they keep one of them around. I don't think they keep both of them around. But if there's 5 deep, it's going to be a little bit of harder sell on me.
The last thing I'll say is that I think if you cut both of them, then it almost makes edge sort of a need to me.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. And it would be a very young group of edge at that point too.
Super young, which
Super young.
I'm into that.
Wow. Okay, Jeremy. Linebackers.
Did you just try to
Sorry.
Kid Rock Jeremy?
I think you did.
No, he said it, not me. We're taking a lot of things out of context here.
What do you want to know about the linebackers, Chris?
How about we reset real quick?
So we're doing the defense primer. So linebackers, right? Who would you re-sign if I'm giving you Wood, Board, and Anzalone, Ryan?
I think
any of those you want to re-sign? 2, 1, all?
Well, you can't find anybody on this roster that I think people did a bigger 180 on than Alex Anzalone this season. I think a lot of people saw him as like one of the biggest head scratching, why are you bringing this guy back players. We've talked about that a little bit, but I think he's essential in bringing back. But it seems like a bug situation. Like bringing Anzalone back doesn't solidify the position in terms of, hey, we can't upgrade it. I think that the Lions cycle through enough linebackers that they could find time for Anzalone, especially on the deal that he'll cost, because he won't command a ton of money. I mean, he had a good season, but I mean, it was an improvement off a, kind of bad season in terms of statistics and things like that, for as much as the Lions coaching staff loved him. But I think you bring back Anzalone. I was kind of disappointed in Board. I guess I was expecting more because I thought that he was going to like take this opportunity to not be a special teamer anymore.
Yeah.
special teamers are great. Like, they're awesome. They're critical players. Look no further than CJ Moore. But are you going to pay a premium at that, or are you going to put somebody on your roster that can hopefully develop into somebody that you'll keep past Alex Anzalone?
I think that's a great observation because even as a special teamer, I would argue that Josh Woods was better as a special teamer this year. I think Josh Woods is maybe one of the better special teams players in the league this past year, and he's also a free agent. So I think Josh Woods is a pretty clear re-signing, especially as a leader, a captain on that special teams unit. But yeah, that's kind of the problem. Is this unit is filled with a lot of special teamers. Anthony Pittman, another special teamer who's in exclusive rights free agent, so he probably comes back on a cheap deal. I think you prioritize Josh Woods over Chris Board, even though Chris Board might have, quote unquote, the potential to be more of a player on defense. But like you said, was there anything he did this year?
Didn't see it this year.
Yeah, I don't know. As far as Anzalone, it's another tricky one for me. I wrote a whole article on it, and I couldn't convince myself one way or the other. But I think Ryan also hit on it there too. Is like there's probably not a harm in re-signing him and then just figuring out if you can upgrade the position again. I don't know if my question is whether Anzalone is going to want to do that. Now, he's professed his love for this coaching staff. He said he loves Detroit and what they're building here, but he's also said that he's prioritized being able to support his family. He said that in 2 different interviews this offseason. So more or less saying, I'm looking for the bag this offseason. And the question is whether, I guess the question then is whether there is going to be another team that values Alex Anzalone as much as
what is the bag, right?
Yeah.
Like, what is the bag becomes the question.
Right.
Yeah.
And is any other team going to want to throw it at him? And I don't know if the answer is yes. So I think the Lions can probably bring him back on an affordable deal, and I think that's probably what's going to end up happening. But don't be surprised if Alex Anzalone tests the free agency market first.
Okay. Want to move on to the secondary?
Oh boy.
Oh boy.
Sure.
So
Where do you start?
what do we have?
Are we starting corner or safety?
Safety seems a little bit clearer. Even without, like, Deshaun Elliott's obviously the question. So let's just start at safety because I feel like this is a
Simpler
easier
one.
Yeah, I feel like this is
simpler.
an easier situation to tease out because could the Lions benefit from bringing Deshaun Elliott back? I mean, yeah, Tracy Walker's injury was a freak injury, but at the same time, I think it's worth having depth at that position if you are a team that runs the defense like the Detroit Lions, because I mean, you could be playing all 3 of those guys theoretically at the same time with Kirby and with Tracy and with Deshaun Elliott. Like,
yeah,
all those guys can see the field at the same time. And they are a team that needs to be at least 3 deep for players who can play defense. And I think what's important in roster construction is you look at that spot, Jeremy, and usually the depth guy on the safety team is a special teamer.
right.
Can you afford too much special teams depth at that spot when the Lions use 3 guys so often? So again, I don't think Deshaun Elliott may have priced himself out just because of some injuries and a really weird pseudo benching that happened in New England. Like, we've come a long way from Deshaun Elliott and the waves that we kind of rode, but we kind of expected that. And when the Lions signed him, right?
And he was fully bought in by week 18, right? Like, he was leading the F the Packers
right
kind of charge in week 18. So I think there would definitely be interest in him bringing back. And I think you bring up a good point. Like, there is no back. I don't think this team is going to rely on Ifatu Melifonwu to be their primary backup as a guy who can come in on some packages. I think it's very possible that if he plays his way off the roster completely this year, if the Lions don't make a move, I think Deshaun Elliott is a good re-signing candidate. I think you almost have to bring back CJ Moore for how important he is on special teams, and then find someone else to challenge.
Is Tracy going to be ready though at the beginning of the season? I think that's an important question.
It is
too.
If you ask Tracy, he says he's going to be back by OTAs, so in 2 months. Which I don't know.
Jeff Okudah was doing a lot of that stuff too, though.
He certainly was. I think there's a good chance he's back at the start of training camp, but you never know what he's going to look like too.
Speaking of Jeff Okuda and cornerbacks, all avoiding this question, right? Yeah, this is. I mean, I can. The only thing I can say for certain, the only thing I know for real, there will be blood. Uh, I think the Lions are probably in day 1 or 2 drafting a cornerback. Hopefully, day 1.
That's a Ryan Matthews level of bold prediction right there.
Yeah, I know. But I mean, Amani Oruwariye is probably out, right?
Yeah. I can't. I mean, there hasn't been a bigger fall from grace than Amani, and I know the coaching staff respects him, and he dealt with the benching, the sudden benching, in a very professional way, but I don't know how you can justify bringing him back.
Right. Well, what about then? Speaking of someone else who had a pretty rough ride, Will Harris. Kind of looked like he was stable for a bit when we were changing his position around, and now it's just
there's a much better case for Will Harris than Namani, right?
Right.
He's
yes.
More,
no, absolutely. Yes.
He's versatile.
Right.
He can play safety. He played okay at nickel down the stretch. It wasn't horrible. He brought a little bit of stability to that position. And he can mess around with special teams a little bit. A nickel is another position that needs a massive upgrade too, though. So maybe he falls into that same category of placeholder that if you can't get to that need this offseason, he'll fill in a pinch. But if you re-sign him, don't clap your hands together and say, oh, okay, we got our nickel position settled.
Will Harris just has to be a guy that the Lions can count on in a pinch.
Right.
I think that's the best way to describe him, is like, you won't feel the bottom fall out of yourself when you hear that Will Harris has replaced, a cornerback on the field, quite like you did when, Amani had to step in spot duty at the end of the season. You're like, well, there goes that side of the field.
What do you do about Mike Hughes coming up here? Unrestricted.
I mean,
was a 2.2 million cap hit this past season.
I think the Lions got to move on, man. I know he ended up. He's another guy that brings versatility. He can play nickel. He can play outside. He essentially jumped Jeff Okuda on the depth chart at the end of the year.
Which is a problem, because we're talking about if he's walking, what starters are we even talking about here? Because you just said Jeff Okuda got jumped on the depth chart too.
Right. And that's why one of the questions I pegged for this segment is, do the Lions have a starting cornerback on the roster right now that is signed for the 2023 season? Is Jeff Okuda, Jerry Jacobs, Chase Lucas, Jaron Williams, Khalil Dorsey, AJ Parker, are any of those? I know AJ Parker's on the Niners now. Are any of those guys capable of starting right now? And I don't. The fact that there isn't a clear answer there is a problem.
Well, and let me ask you this, because we have understood the Lions' philosophy is you don't want to go into a draft so desperate at a position. So it feels like cornerback could be a big target in free agency, just at the very least to staunch the bleeding. So I guess 100%. My question is, is Mike Hughes, is that someone you just bring back because you can't really risk going in to the draft with nobody? Or is there anyone out there in a free agency class that, quite honestly, I don't feel great about a lot of these corners that are up on the market right now?
Well, I mean, James Bradbury is a name that commonly pops up there, and he's going to cost a pretty penny, and he's kind of inching towards that 30-year-old mark. It's why people have started to speculate that maybe Jalen Ramsey is a smart guy to go after, to try to trade for him, another guy that's going to cost a lot in draft resources and free agency. Cap space. But yeah, I know I'm with you. They need to figure something out here, and I don't have a good solution in free agency, at least.
I think the one other name that I see getting tossed around is Jamel Dean, the cornerback from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He seems to be a value contract guy that the Lions could get for not top end money, but he's definitely getting a pay bump. But
would you trust something Would you trust something like I'm trying to think of like a good example that could be like a DJ Shark? Get a guy who's been like had some injuries and just here to prove it. Like I think Greedy Williams, like he flashed well first couple years and he's been dealing with the hamstring issues. Like, do you get just is that where the Lions go to rebuild this position? Is get some guys on prove it deals and then
Yeah,
cross your fingers and hope you hit strong in the draft.
I think that's a smart strategy. I don't have a specific name in mind, but yeah, that has kind of been the Lions' MO when they need to like rehaul an entire room. Is like, let's sign a bunch of guys to 1 year deals that have had success in the past, but have hit hard times for one reason or another. See if they can do that, and in the meantime, we'll hit hard in the draft too.
I think cornerback though is the one spot on this roster where there is no amount of convincing, there is no amount of coach speak, there is no amount of quote unquote it's going to be like a bloodbath competition that the coaches can say, "Oh, we're cool with the cornerback group," without doing like massive things to it. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
there's no pulling what they did with the linebacker group last year with the cornerbacks going into next year. There's no way. Like there needs to be so much invested in cornerback because, like Jeremy said, name the two outside corners for the Detroit Lions.
I mean, it's probably Jerry Jacobs and Jeff Okuda right now, right? And I know there's still some hope for Jeff Okuda. I'm not trying to bury him.
There's still hope for Jerry Jacobs too.
Sure. But you can't rely on that at this point. You can't assume that Jeff Okuda is suddenly going to turn around his career in year 4. And they got a tough decision with him too, right? With the 5th-year option that they need to make by May 1st. I think we can all say, as things stand right now, it would be very surprising they pick up that 5th-year option, but we'll see.